So I'll start talking about it like this. I don't know how to start this off, but for those of you who don't know, Missing 411, it's this series of books and media written by a former police investigator named David Paulides. He's gone around and collected all these missing persons reports that follow along very similar criteria in order to gain a better perspective of these very specific instances where people go missing, the locations of where these people go missing, and how everything is interconnected into a similar dialogue is typically relegated to a format of wilderness, heavy tree growth, boulder areas, places named Devil, national parks, clusters in certain areas that people don't really know about in terms of the amount of people that go missing in them. And from my own personal account related to boulder fields, when I was hiking around one years ago in Colorado, I actually captured an anomaly on my camera, which was very odd, and I can't really explain it other than I had this feeling of great fear and paranoia as I was walking around that specific area. As I was walking down from the place where I took the picture of this guy actually, like almost word for word from how these stories end up, kind of ran past me as I was walking down this side of the mountain that had no trail, but he kind of like grazed me right next to me as I was walking down, and I guess had this like really stern, focused look on his face. So these stories go back to 1700s, 1800s, where there are few accounts, but they start ramping up rapidly as more and more people start moving into North America. And this is typically the place where we have these reports and have access to them, are mostly Canada and the United States. And after reading these three books, I've come to a conjectural analysis of my own of the circumstances and possible reasoning for these disappearances or these abductions. And there's not a whole lot of information out there because when people go missing, typically no one in terms of anyone over the age of maybe 12 or 13 ever really comes back alive. This is a pattern that I'll get into more, but I'd like to actually go ahead and start classifying two different types of disappearances. Not that I'm an expert on the subject, but I feel for my own sake and hopefully for other people, you can get a better sense of the differences between these sorts of disappearances and ones that are related to triangle areas. So I'm sure everyone has heard of places like the Bermuda Triangle and locations where there's very weird activity where people can go missing, and there's not a lot of information about where they go, but disconnecting these accounts from the missing 411 cases for the reasoning that there are different mechanisms behind the way in which these two groups of people who go missing disappear. In the Bermuda Triangle, people will be sailing in a boat, a storm will come, and then they'll disappear off the earth forever. In a place called the Bennington Triangle, there was a story of someone who was sleeping on a bus, and when people were looking around for him on the bus after they got to a certain stop, he just vanished out of thin air. In the missing 411 cases, you're given a different flavor of missing people, and the story typically involves some sort of weird, almost mind control possession instigator that drags people away from a group of people, and then you're sort of left with this story where people almost run away and then aren't seen from again for 3 days. They'll be found alive, or they'll find a body of some kind at some point. So to add some criteria to the reasoning or mechanism behind why people go missing in these missing 411 cases, we have to look almost in this very specific pattern where people go missing in terms of location and who these people are. Some graphs show twice as many males disappearing as females. More people will disappear later in the year. As for the adults that go missing, they typically have some sort of intellectual background. They have doctorates, they're from MIT, they have physics degrees. Another factor is that people will a lot of times go missing wearing the color red. These people will either be alone or they will run off from a group of people and then the group won't see them again. Clearly we can see a pattern between people who are intellectual as well as children in general who are involved in these cases. So as we get into the identification of the perpetrators of these disappearances, it becomes even more vague. You have very few reports of this. People back in the 1800s claiming they see large wolves taking children with their arms and sort of groveling away. Other reports say that they're big bears that seem to almost have human personalities that children will be right next to when the search teams find them. These animals will come up more and more as children recall being around these animals during their disappearances. Giant black wolf, big dog, mother bear, things like that. Some people will claim to see actual people, but they're darting behind trees and they're said to be looking like very shabby looking men with something very large on their backs. There's also these stories where women hikers, where they're walking alone down a path, they'll hear roving gangs of crazy men following them. They can't see them, but they hear all this shouting and yelling and stalking. But there was one instance where there was this woman who was hiking down a path and she heard this crowd of men that was following her, yelling and screaming. And her idea was to start pretending that there were people up ahead of her. So she started waving at them and saying, "Hey, what's up?" And she heard from behind her that the group of men started running up a hill and weren't heard from since. The closest approximation I can make to where people have these experiences where they see these dogs or encounter these strange, weird voices or what have you are typically relegated in Navajo culture. I don't have enough information about it, but they refer to them as skinwalkers or witches that use other people's bodies as houses so they can have some sort of experience through them. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I wanted to throw that idea out there in case there was some sort of connection that made sense to some people. If we're keeping this in a very scientific, logical, police matter, legal sense, then we really don't have a lot to go off on. These disappearances are happening in these ways that we can't perceive or understand or scientifically calculate with our current technology. As for the mechanism behind how people run off, it's almost stranger than anything else. In these cases, you see people that will just all of a sudden start saying to a group of people that they're hiking with that they want to run off somewhere, and then when they do, they're never seen from again. There's instances where people will be running or walking by other people, and the people will say, "Hey, how's it going?" and the person walking won't respond. Other instances include ones where people just sort of are in their cars and they'll drive off to this remote part of the park and they'll leave all their possessions in the car or around it and just run off into the woods somewhere. So after the person disappears and a search and rescue is initiated, you see sort of this building of these patterns as to how people go out searching for the missing person, don't come back with anything, and then days later will find them dead or alive somewhere miles away. One piece of evidence that was interesting was that people will run these very long distances, like 10 miles, 15 miles, 20 miles sometimes, and have just their feet completely destroyed. It's almost like they smoked meth and just ran off somewhere for no apparent reason. In these children's cases where they'll run off, they'll typically find them under a tree or a log or somewhere around a body of water typically, and they won't be able to recall any of their experiences. There was one case that was very odd where an adult actually survived their experience and said they went to some very dark forest or like this almost a different realm or something, and somehow managed to get out of it, but they were in this daze of confusion and pain and paranoia that was unlike anything they'd ever experienced before. There was an instance where there was a child missing, and when search and rescue found them, the child actually looked at them and then ran away at an unbelievable speed in the other direction. Running at high speeds away from a group of people is actually quite common. And again, the only approximation of the evidence connected to the instigator of these disappearances is corroborated, or at least given in part to some form of evidence to the investigators by the children reciting some story about seeing some large wolf or bear or something that they were hanging out with. They'll be doing things that people who live in a modern society wouldn't typically do, and from a hunter-gatherer's perspective would be more than likely a very, very smart, logical way to survive in the wilderness. Where they get this information of how they do this kind of goes back to the possession thing, where it seems like these aren't the minds of people or children who are getting lost, but rather that of a very specific person somewhere who is living vicariously through these people. And in conclusion, I think these are really good stories. They're scary and compelling, but I think everyone needs to sit down and look at them and see that it's not a good idea to be walking out in the woods or in the wilderness alone a lot of the time, because the way these instances happen all kind of go around the same path, where there'll be someone who gets disconnected from a group and then they're never found again, or at least when they are found, it's this harrowing, crazy experience that no one wants to go through. I'll definitely be reading more of these books and these cases in the future, but as it is for right now, I hope this has been informative to everyone who is interested or has some questions about these sorts of disappearances, that we as a society as a whole can better understand and be more aware of what happens out in the wilderness.